Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we embark on a journey that will take us not just across centuries, but through the treacherous, sun-baked soil of myth itself. You are standing on a dusty, wind-swept hill in what is modern-day Turkey, the Aegean Sea sparkling like spilled diamonds in the distance. The air smells of wild thyme and ancient regret. Around you are deep, brutal trenches that look less like archaeological digs and more like the scars left by a forgotten giant. You can almost hear the ghostly shouts of bronze-clad warriors, the creak of the legendary Trojan horse, and the desperate weeping of a city collapsing after a 10-year siege. This is where we begin our hunt, following a 3,000-year-old treasure map, drawn by a blind poet. A map that would lead one obsessed man to missing millions, global celebrity, and a lifetime of relentless controversy. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening while tucked in somewhere cozy, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far our little history caravan travels. One reality check before we start. You probably won't survive this journey with your faith in pure historical fact intact. Because the story of the lost city of Troy is a messy one. A tale of fraud, passion, destruction, and a historical figure who is either the greatest hero of archaeology or its most dazzling villain. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story starts far from the shimmering Aegean, in the freezing, unremarkable Prussian village of Neubucko in 1822. Here you meet a small, wide-eyed boy named Heinrich Schliemann. You're walking with him through the parsonage garden, where his father, a pastor who loved drink and tall tales, would hold him wrapped with stories of the great heroes. Think of the kid you know who can recite every line from their favourite epic. That was Heinrich, only his epic was the Iliad, and his heroes were Achilles and Hector. His father, Ernst Schliemann, was the original unreliable source. Ernst would show young Heinrich an engraving in an old history book, a dramatic picture depicting the burning city of Troy, its mighty walls collapsing. And this is the mainstream historical fact we must ground ourselves in. For nearly 2,500 years, the city of Troy was considered by most of the enlightened world to be nothing more than a beautiful literary invention. A thrilling fantasy dreamed up by Homer, a convenient backdrop for stories about gods interfering in mortal affairs, and the destructive nature of human hubris. No one seriously looked for it, just as no one seriously hunts for ounces. It was simply the beginning of Western literature, not the site of a past geopolitical conflict. But Heinrich, the imaginative boy standing there in the cold German mud, pointed to the picture and asked his father, "Is it true, Papa? Did this really happen?" His father, perhaps slightly tipsy or just enjoying the moment, assured him, "Yes, my son, it is true." Then young Heinrich, with the absolute terrifying certainty only a 9-year-old can possess, declared, "Then I will find it. I will dig it up." You see, that was the first whispered declaration that launched a $30 million adjusted for inflation, easily more search. The boy's path, however, was not immediately set on scholarly pursuit. You watch his life take a sharp, agonizing detour. Financial ruin hits his family, his mother dies, and the dreams of a classical education evaporate like morning mist. Instead of Latin and Greek, you see him bound out to apprenticeship as a grocer's boy. You stand next to him in a dull, dusty store, scooping herring and better, his hands smelling of stale cheese instead of sea salt in adventure. His formal schooling ends at age 14. This shift from potential scholar to humble shop assistant is central to his later character. He gained a ruthless, self-made drive, but he missed the methodical, evidence-based rear of a proper academic training. Now, here is a quirky tidbit about young Schliemann's desperate drive for knowledge that speaks to his almost superhuman focus. While working as a ship's cabin boy, and later as a bookkeeper in Amsterdam, he was so poor he couldn't afford to heat his tiny garret room. To save on lamp oil, he would study language by reading aloud, even late at night in the streetlights of Amsterdam. He developed a bizarre, high-speed method for learning languages. He would read texts aloud until he memorized them, and hire a poor native speaker to correct his pronunciation, while he told them the story of his life in that new tongue. You watch him devour Dutch, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Russian in a matter of weeks, treating languages like puzzles to be solved, not cultures to be understood. He would learn a staggering 15 languages over his lifetime, a polyglot superpower that would be essential for negotiating with sultans and archaeologists alike. It's this gift for language that becomes his real treasure map. It takes him from the back streets of Amsterdam to St. Petersburg, Russia. The year is 1846, and he's 24. You follow him as he becomes an independent merchant dealing in indigo dye, and, crucially, a silent partner in the arms trade during the Crimean War. This is where the missing millions part of our narrative truly begins. War is brutal, yes, but it's also astonishingly profitable for those who can move supplies. Schliemann, with his language skills and relentless energy, becomes a master of arbitrage, buying cheap, selling dear, and moving fortunes with stunning speed. He was a man who saw opportunity where others saw chaos. You see him travel to America, arriving during the California gold rush, where he briefly sets up a bank in Sacramento. He becomes a naturalized American citizen, which will become a diplomatic shield later when he starts stealing Ottoman artifacts. By 1864, still only 42 years old, he had amassed what would today be a staggering fortune, enough to retire comfortably anywhere in the world. He was wealthy beyond the dreams of his childhood, the kind of wealth that buys governments. But money was only the means to an end. The man he made his fortune selling military supplies was haunted by the image of the ruined walls of Troy. He closes his businesses, leaves his first unhappy Russian marriage, and dedicates the rest of his life to finding a lost city. His method of accumulating wealth was brutal, fast, and often ethically questionable. You're about to see him apply that exact same reckless ambition to the gentle art of archaeology. His self-proclaimed historical sabbatical begins with a journey around the world, followed by a trip to the Troad, the general geographical region in northwest Anatolia where Homer had placed the city. He wasn't the first to look, but he was the first with the means and the sheer arrogance to believe he could find it. He travels to the region in 1868, armed with a copy of the Iliad, and the unwavering belief that the poet's descriptions were a literal travel guide. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's self-taught approach was a net positive for archaeology, sparking global interest and huge finds, or a disaster that destroyed crucial evidence in his blind rush for treasure. His initial focus was a site called Bunarbashi, which was the traditionally accepted location for Troy. But after pacing the site, consulting his Homer, and calculating the distance to the sea and the rivers, he rejects it. It just didn't fit the epic's narrative. Instead, he begins to focus on a modest, artificial-looking mound of earth that rose about 100 feet above the plain, known locally as Hisarlik. The land belonged partly to the Ottoman government, and partly to a British expatriate named Frank Calvert, a man whose knowledge of the region and whose scholarly patience stood in stark opposition to Schliemann's relentless treasure-hunting zeal. It was Calvert, not Schliemann, who first correctly identified Hisarlik as the true site of Troy, but Calvert lacked the financial might to dig. Schliemann had the money, the ego, and the complete absence of caution, and he was about to start bigging with the subtlety of a man attacking a cake with a bulldozer, driven by the simple, enduring vision of a small German boy who dared to believe his father's bedtime story. And now leave the cold, quiet parlour of Neubacher and follow Heinrich Schliemann into a world defined by sheer, relentless hustle. The idyllic dream of finding Troy had to be shelved for a decade and a half while reality, in the form of grinding poverty, took centre stage. You watch him at 14, he's back-aching, hands chapped, serving customers in a miserable grocery shop. He is scooping out dried peas and molasses, a world away from the golden splendour of Priam's court. But remember that single-minded focus he showed with languages. He applied that exact same intensity to survival, and ultimately, to wealth acquisition. He never truly abandoned the Iliad, he simply postponed it. The pivotal, life-altering shift happens after a violent storm. You're on the Baltic Sea, watching a small sailing ship flounder in the waves. Schliemann, now a cabin boy, is shipwrecked off the coast of the Netherlands. He arrives in Amsterdam, essentially penniless. Yet this moment of disaster becomes his launchpad. He secures a job as an office boy and later as a bookkeeper for a prominent merchant house. This is where he discovers his true, terrifying genius. A flair for languages combined with a ruthless aptitude for international finance and trade. You stand in that cramped office, watching him work. He's not just a bookkeeper, he's a sponge. He soaks up Russian, the language of the vast, expanding markets of the East, and you watch him master it in 6 weeks flat. It's not about appreciation for Pushkin, it's about commerce. He realizes that Russia is a sleeping giant of trade, and few Western merchants can communicate directly. He uses his ability to bypass layers of translators and middlemen, immediately giving him a colossal edge. This incredible linguistic skill leads him to St. Petersburg in 1846, where he sets up his own independent trading firm. This is the mainstream historical fact you need to lock onto. Schliemann's fortune was built primarily on lucrative trade with Russia, dealing in commodities like indigo, lead, and tea. He was an expert in timing markets and exploiting logistical bottlenecks. This commercial background, though far from academia, gave him two things essential for his later excavation: absolute independence from funding bodies and an aggressive, risk-taking mindset that saw obstacles as merely challenges to be overwhelmed. The true source of his explosive, controversial wealth, however, is the Crimean War 1853-1856. You see him pivot his business to military supplies, particularly dealing in materials necessary for the conflict. War is the ultimate accelerator of wealth for those positioned correctly. Schliemann was a master of exploiting shortages and capitalizing on inflated wartime prices. He wasn't on the front lines, but he was deep in the logistical trenches, where the real money often lay. It is widely alleged he engaged in price gouging and perhaps other questionable practices. The details are murky, but the outcome is clear. The man who had been scooping herring now commanded a fortune. He travels to the United States in 1850, briefly dabbling in the California gold rush after his brother died there. This short American chapter is significant because it's where he becomes a US citizen, a decision that would prove strategically vital later. When he steals artifacts from the Ottoman Empire, his American passport provides a measure of diplomatic protection, making it harder for foreign powers to simply jail him. He's always thinking several steps ahead, leveraging nationality and wealth as tools of conquest, much like an ancient general. By 1864, at age 42, Schliemann declares himself done with the humiliating occupation of commerce. He sells off his Russian interests and liquidates his assets. His wealth is now secured, managed by savvy investments. The Iliad is officially back in print in his mind. He embarks on a grand world tour, but it's not a relaxed vacation, it's reconnaissance. He visits China, Japan, India, and writes detailed, often self-aggrandizing travel journals. This entire period is his transition from merchant prince to self-styled archaeologist adventure. The most important trip, however, is his journey to the Troad in 1868. He arrives not with a trowel and a screen, but with a well-thumbed copy of Homer, a massive ego, and sacks of gold. He views the Iliad as a historical document, a 3,000-year-old treasure map, and he dismisses the prevailing scholarly opinion that Troy was merely myth. He felt the academics were simply too comfortable in their armchairs to undertake the brutal real-world search he was now financing. You follow him as he paces the dusty plain, seeking out landmarks described by Homer, the windy Troy, the rivers Scamander and Simois, the great ships drawn up on the beach. He first examines the traditional site, a hill named Bonarbashi, or Pinarbashi. But this site is too far from the sea for the Greek heroes to have run between their ships and the city easily, as Homer described. Also, the two cold springs there didn't fit Homer's description of one hot and one cold spring. Schliemann dismisses Bonarbashi with the same abruptness he would have fired a slow clerk. His logic, for all its lack of scholarly rigour, was based on an almost fanatical literal interpretation of the poetic text. This is the unassuming hill that an obscure British consul, Frank Calvert, had already quietly identified as the most probable site. Calvert, who owned a portion of the hill, had actually conducted small preliminary test digs and published his theories, which were largely other theories. Calvert discovered what he thought would suffer a sudden bead in size because of what's telling, or what happened when he joined the fear. Schliemann, with his typical mix of genius and ethical corner-cutting, learns of Calvert's work, visits him, and effectively co-opts the idea. He's a quirky tidbit about the lengths Schliemann would go to in order to legitimize his status. He desperately wanted a proper academic pedigree. So, in 1869, he publishes his research on the Troad Ithaca, the Peloponnese and Troy, a book so full of exaggerations and factual errors that it almost derailed his academic career before it began. Nevertheless, he managed to rush to Rostock University in Germany, and using a previously written dissertation he quickly adapted, he pressured the faculty into awarding him a PhD in absentia. The diploma was granted, a clear case of wealth and self-promotion overriding academic standards. He could now call himself Dr. Schliemann, adding a thin veneer of legitimacy to his audacious plans. He travels back to the Troad, now ready to buy or lease the land at Hisarlik. He had to negotiate with two key parties, the Ottoman government, which held the legal rights to all archaeological finds in the empire, and Frank Calvert, who owned the eastern half of the hill. Calvert, an amateur scholar of genuine integrity, was willing to sell or lease his portion, but he made it clear that the ultimate goal should be careful study. Schliemann, meanwhile, was focused on one thing: getting commission to swing the biggest shovel available. The negotiations with the Ottoman Empire were a delicate dance. They were, in the middle of the 19th century, well aware of the value of their ancient heritage, having seen countless foreign explorers make off with artifacts. Yet they were also corruptible and under constant financial strain. Schliemann, armed with his American citizenship in bottomless pockets, secured a foeman, or official digging permit, in 1871. This permit was crucial. It stipulated that all major finds belonged to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, and that Schliemann was only allowed to keep duplicates of common artifacts. You can almost hear Schliemann scoffing at the conditions. He had retired from commerce because he hated rules, and now he was being given archaeological rules. He viewed the permit not as a contract to abide by, but as a tedious technicality to be navigated and ultimately circumvented. His aim was not to share and study. His aim was to find the treasure of King Priam and prove his 9-year-old self right. And that is where the tragedy of Hisarlik begins, because Schliemann, convinced that the legendary glorious Troy of the Iliad must lie at the lowest, deepest level of the mound, decides to simply blast his way down. He's not interested in the Byzantine layers near the top, or the Greek or Roman cities built over the top of the Bronze Age remains. He employs hundreds of local labourers, cheap labour, and instructs them to dig a colossal trench, a 40-foot deep, ruinous cut right through the centre of the hill. He later called this a great trench. Scholars would call it the Schliemann Trench and lament it as an act of archaeological vandalism. Historians still argue whether Schliemann intentionally ignored the stratigraphic layers above his desired Bronze Age level, or if the archaeological science of stratigraphy was simply too undeveloped at the time for him to fully appreciate the damage he was doing. Regardless, you watch him, shovels in hand, a man who had finally put his millions to use, but whose passion for history was about to destroy priceless history in its very pursuit. The hunt for the lost city was officially underway, financed by arms dealing and ego. You now stand with Heinrich Schliemann on the windswept mound of Hisarlik in the Troad in the year 1871. The Aegean sun beats down and the air is thick with the dust of ages and the tension of international diplomacy. Schliemann has the money. He has the obsession. He now needs the official right to swing a pickaxe. This is where the world of Homer meets the bureaucracy of the declining Ottoman Empire. Imagine the scene. A self-made, relentless German-American merchant, utterly convinced he is a reincarnation of a Trojan hero, negotiating with the sophisticated, if somewhat fatigued, officials of the Sublime Porte. The Ottomans, centred in Constantinople, were already painfully aware that their vast historical lands were being systematically plundered by European powers masquerading as scholars. They had seen the Elgin marbles removed from Greece, and countless treasures siphoned out of Egypt and Mesopotamia. They were trying, however, imperfectly, to impose order on the chaos of archaeological exploration. Schliemann's approach, typically, was both direct and deceitful. He needed a firman, the official Ottoman permit to excavate. His negotiations focused on two things: convincing the authorities that Hisarlik was merely a hill of minor importance, certainly not the famed Troy they should worry about, and offering generous but strategically vague financial assurances. He employed an Armenian agent named Nikolaos Voulgaris to handle the delicate, often corrupt negotiations in Constantinople, while Schliemann himself charmed and cajoled the local officials. The permit he eventually obtained in early 1871 was a document designed to protect the Ottoman heritage. This is the mainstream historical fact regarding the legal framework. The firman stipulated that half of all artifacts found must be surrendered to the Imperial Museum, the Meters USA ZZI, Mayun in Constantinople, and the Ottomans retained ownership of the most significant pieces. Schliemann was explicitly committed to keep only duplicates of common finds. You can see the barely concealed smirk on his face as he reads this. To Schliemann, the permit was merely a necessary piece of expensive paper, not a contract. He was already planning its violation. His immediate challenge upon arrival was practical. Hisarlik was part-owned by Frank Calvert, the scholarly, patient British consul who had first correctly identified the site. Schliemann secured a lease from Calvert, a transaction that always sat uncomfortably for the Brit. Calvert had the knowledge and the integrity. Schliemann had the inexhaustible funds and the wrecking ball energy. Calvert, who owned the eastern half of the mound, allowed Schliemann to begin digging on his portion. essentially gifting the obsessed millionaire the correct location for his historical quest. Without Calvert's initial identification and permission, Schliemann might have spent years fruitlessly digging elsewhere. Now, Schliemann faced the actual start of the project. He hired a massive workforce, hundreds of local Turkish and Greek labourers, and armed them not with fine brushes and careful trowels, but with pickaxes, shovels and wheelbarrows. He was determined to move mountains, literally. He was racing against time, against scholarly opinion, and most importantly, against the strict terms of his Ottoman permit. His instructions to the crew were simple and terrifyingly effective. Dig deep, dig fast, and ignore anything that isn't clearly gold or massive stone walls. He was obsessed with finding the treasure of Priam, and the mighty walls of Homer's Troy, which he believed lay in the earliest, deepest layers of the site. Everything else was, in his view, the dirt of inferior, later civilizations, Byzantine, Roman and Greek settlements, that is simply built on top of the true prize. This is where his method, later condemned as Schliemannism, took its devastating toll. Instead of carefully peeling back the layers of history one by one, the stratigraphy that tells the story of successive cities built atop one another, Schliemann ordered a massive deep trench cut right through the middle of the mound. You watch the labourers dig, creating a colossal 40-foot deep, 50-foot wide gash that today is known as the Schliemann Trench. It's less a surgical excavation, and more a controlled demolition. The irony is that in his blind, desperate quest for a single glorious city which he called Troy II, he unwittingly destroyed large sections of the most likely candidate for the Homeric city, the layer known to modern archaeology as Troy VI or Troy VIIa, which lay higher up the mound. He literally dug through the city he was looking for, only pausing to notice when he had completely passed it. The speed and scale of the operation were unprecedented in 19th century archaeology. Here is a quirky tidbit that illustrates his control and the sheer scale of the operation. Schliemann paid his hundreds of workers a pittance, typically a day's wage that was just enough to keep him coming back. However, to motivate them and bypass the Ottoman inspectors, he would occasionally announce that he would pay a hefty bonus, a literal sack of silver coins, to the first worker who brought him a spectacular piece of pottery or a bronze artifact. This incentivized his crew to prioritize his personal treasure hunt over careful, systematic digging, and, crucially, to bring finds directly to him, away from the prying eyes of Ottoman officialdom. It was a private bounty system designed for theft. Schliemann, for all his destructive methods, was a meticulous recorder of his own activities, if not a meticulous excavator. He kept detailed diaries and hired draftsmen to sketch the walls and artifacts. These records, though often biased and self-serving, are a core part of the mainstream historical fact of the discovery. He needed them to prove to the world that he, Heinrich Schliemann, had triumphed where scholars had scoffed. He was writing his own story as he dug. As the digging progressed, the labourers began to reveal the reality of Hisarlik. It was not one Troy, but 9 or more cities built one on top of the other, like layers in a historical cake. This realization that the hill was a massive tell, a mound of successive settlements, was revolutionary, even if Schliemann initially failed to grasp the significance of all the layers. He was convinced that the earliest, most monumental construction must be the city of Priam. He focused on a deeper layer, which he labelled Troy II. This level, which he exposed in a spectacular way, showed signs of monumental walls and a devastating conflagration. It was a Bronze Age citadel, complete with imposing ramparts and gates. This, Schliemann declared, was it, the glorious burnt city described by Homer. You see him pacing the site, triumph radiating from him, utterly convinced he had achieved his childhood dream. Historians still argue whether Schliemann genuinely misinterpreted the context of his finds, or if he deliberately fabricated his dating to align his discovery with the Homeric narrative he was desperate to prove. The key problem, which modern science would later reveal, is that the city he called Troy II was destroyed around 2500 BC, a full 1,200 years before the conventionally accepted time of the Trojan War, around 1250 BC. The city of the Iliad would have been much closer to the layer he had mostly dug through, Troy 657a. But truth was a small obstacle to a man riding a tide of self-aggrandizement. The challenge of an unsanctioned dig was the constant presence of the Ottoman Imperial Commissioner, tasked with enforcing the firman. Schliemann had to be constantly vigilant, hiding important finds, sometimes literally wrapping artifacts in his own clothing and smuggling them out under the cover of darkness. He viewed the Ottoman government not as the legal owner of the heritage, but as a greedy rival trying to steal his legitimate spoils of war. This sets the stage for the dramatic, brazen theft of the most spectacular find yet, the gold hoard that would forever be known as Priam's treasure. You can feel the fever pitch rising on Hisarlik, a small, dusty hill that was rapidly turning into the stage for a historical heist. You are now immersed in the dust and sweat of Hisarlik in the early 1870s, standing at the edge of the monstrous Schliemann Trench. Below you, the sheer scale of the excavation is breathtaking, or perhaps sickening, depending on your perspective. Heinrich Schliemann, with his bottomless resources and singular goal, is literally tearing the guts out of the hill. He has hundreds of workers, all motivated by his erratic yet powerful zeal, shoveling away centuries of history with reckless abandon. His central belief, the fuel for this destructive energy, is that the most glorious, powerful and Homeric Troy must lie at the very bottom, closest to the bedrock. He views the immense accumulation of earth and ruins above this level as merely the detritus of inferior successors. He is a man with tunnel vision, driving the equivalent of a historical road as part of the world body. The town's body must readily perform war. As the trench sinks deeper, the labourers begin to reveal the astonishing reality of the site. It's not one ruined city, but a complex archaeological tell, a monumental, man-made mound created by the constant cycle of destruction and rebuilding over thousands of years. This phenomenon, characteristic of ancient settlements across the Near East, means that every layer, every stratum, represents a distinct period of habitation, a completely different city, often with its own walls, pottery and culture. Schliemann, for all his lack of formal training, was the first to systematically expose this immense depth of settlement at Hisarlik. You watch as the sheer weight of evidence forces him to categorize these successive habitations. This becomes a fundamental mainstream historical fact of the site. Schliemann defined 9 major layers, which are now typically referred to as Troy I through Troy IX. Each number represents a different city built on the ruins of the last. Troy I is the earliest settlement, dating back to the Neolithic Age, a crude early Bronze Age fortress. Troy IX is the latest, a massive, thriving city established by the Romans, sometimes called Ilium Novum, or New Troy. Schliemann, however, was in a desperate hurry to find the Homeric citadel. He rapidly dismissed Troy I as too primitive. He dug past the upper layers, the Greek and Roman cities of Troy 8 and 9, with barely a note, simply discarding the pottery and architectural remains that would later prove invaluable for dating and context. He was a treasure hunter, not a stratigraphic analyst, and anything that wasn't the supposed city of King Priam was merely overburdened to be removed. His focus quickly narrowed to the second layer from the bottom, which he labelled Troy II. This layer was truly impressive. The labourers uncovered massive sloping stone ramparts, cyclopean walls that spoke of a powerful Bronze Age citadel. Crucially, Schliemann found abundant evidence of a cataclysmic fiery destruction. Burnt debris, charred timbers, and layers of ash suggested the city had been violently brought to an end. This was it, he concluded, the city destroyed by the Achaeans, the glorious Troy of the Iliad. You can almost hear the excited shouts echoing down the trench as he finally finds what he considers physical proof of his childhood dream. The walls of Troy too were monumental, certainly fitting the descriptions of mighty walled Troy. Night, wakeful boxing is better than you. He found striking architectural features, including large buildings of the megaron type, a rectangular hall with an open porch, which he instantly dubbed the Palace of Priam. But this is where his zeal catastrophically outpaced his scholarship. What Schliemann failed to recognise, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the immense gulf of time between the destruction of Troy II and the generally accepted date of the Trojan War, which scholars place around 1250 BC. Modern carbon dating in ceramic analysis now confirm that Troy II was destroyed around 2500 BC, a full millennium and a quarter before the legendary conflict. Schliemann had found a magnificent, burnt Bronze Age city, but it was the wrong magnificent, burnt Bronze Age city. He had essentially mistaken a grandfather for his great-great-great-grandson. Here is a quirky tidbit about the misdating. Schliemann's greatest error in this early phase came down to a simple lack of comparative data. European archaeology was still in its infancy, and Bronze Age dating standards for the Aegean were virtually non-existent. Schliemann's principal method for dating was quite literally Homer. If the pottery looked suitably ancient, and the walls were suitably mighty, he declared it Homeric. The crucial evidence of Mycenaean and Minoan pottery, which would have allowed more precise cross-dating with other sites, was often either overlooked or misinterpreted in his rush to prove his thesis. The true candidate for Homeric Troy, as we now understand it, lay significantly higher up the mound, in the levels Schliemann had blasted through, Troy 6 and its immediate successor, Troy 7 AD. Troy 6, a much larger, sprawling city that existed roughly during the period of the Trojan War, was characterized by immensely strong, sophisticated limestone walls and towers. However, Schliemann's Great Trench had cut right through the middle of this crucial layer, destroying vast amounts of potential evidence and leaving only fragments. He even misidentified some of Troy 6's monumental walls as simply later Roman or Hellenistic constructions and therefore irrelevant. This leaves us to the crucial academic debate phrase. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's destructive Great Trench at Hisarlik was an unavoidable, necessary evil that secured permission and funding to prove Troy's existence, or if it was an irreparable act of archaeological malpractice that forever blinded us to the true scale of the Homeric city. The reality is, but Schliemann established a physical existence of a settlement at Hisarlik dating back to the Bronze Age, but in doing so he severely compromised the evidence for the very city he sought. You see him, the triumphant Dr. Schliemann, standing amidst the ruins of Troy II. Schliemann's hat is widened with histoline for its 4th century, but the greatest drama, the discovery of the treasure that would make him internationally infamous and kick off the global ethical debate about cultural ownership, was yet to come. The man who had amassed millions by exploiting war and commerce was about to achieve legendary status by exploiting history. The pressure mounts as he realizes the magnitude of his discovery and the ever-present threat of the Ottoman Imperial Commissioner, who was supposed to be monitoring the excavation to ensure the firman was upheld. Schliemann knew his contract stipulated that any major find had to go to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. The next step in his career, from wealthy eccentric to historical icon, required him to outwit an entire empire and steal his own discovery. His eyes, fixed on the layers of Troy II, are not just seeing ancient ruins, they are seeing gold. You are now watching the delicate balance of Hisarlik start to tip, caught between two opposing forces, the careful scholarly caution of Frank Calvert and the relentless, often brutal zeal of Heinrich Schliemann. It's the classic clash between meticulous science and passionate, ego-driven ambition. He's the man who actually owned the eastern part of the hill, and was the true intellectual pioneer who identified Hisarlik as the probable site of Troy. He was the British vice-consul in the Dardanelles, a lifelong resident of the Troad, and a dedicated, if underfunded, amateur archaeologist. Calvert represented the scholarly integrity that Schliemann desperately lacked, and it was Calvert he repeatedly tried to offer advice that Schliemann, in his headlong rush for glory, consistently ignored. You see Calvert attempting to explain the concept of stratigraphy to the frenzied Schliemann. Stratigraphy is the mainstream historical fact that is the backbone of modern archaeology. The principle that the deeper you dig, the older the layers of settlement are, and that these layers must be carefully excavated and recorded separately to understand the chronological sequence of a site. Calvert understood that Hisarlik was not one city, but a complex tale containing the remnants of many different settlements, built one upon the other. Calvert watched in dismay as Schliemann's massive Great Trench sliced through the mound. He saw the priceless evidence of successive civilizations, particularly the substantial remains of the city now known as Troy 6, being tossed aside like so much rubble. Calvert knew that Troy the 6, with its massive walls and signs of violent destruction, dated to the period generally associated with the Bronze Age collapse, making it the most plausible candidate for Homer's Troy. Schliemann, fixed on proving his childhood belief that the deepest, most archaic-looking city must be Priam's, was literally throwing away the true answer. You can picture the strained conversations between the two men. Calvert, trying to sound helpful, perhaps suggesting a smaller controlled section be excavated first. Schliemann, impatient and convinced of his own singular genius, would merely nod dismissively before issuing orders to his hundreds of workers to dig deeper and faster. Schliemann's diaries from the time are full of praise for his own success and barely concealed condescension for Calvert's more modest, careful approach. He viewed caution as cowardice and methodical process as a waste of time. This difference in approach illuminates Schliemann's character. He was an exceptional businessman and a great linguist, but his archaeological methods were essentially a continuation of his business practices: brute force, overwhelming resources, and a single, ruthless objective. He wasn't reading the book of history layer by layer. He was ripping out the pages until he found the chapter he wanted. Here is a quirky tidbit that reveals how Schliemann manipulated the narrative even while digging. He was deeply troubled by the fact that the architecture of his beloved Troy II, the 2500 BC layer, was much smaller and architecturally less grand than the city Homer described. So, he simply decided to expand the city in his own records and plans, sketching walls and structures that were never actually found, simply to make it appear more like the sprawling, glorious metropolis of Priam. He wasn't recording history, he was illustrating his own interpretation of it. Schliemann's focus on Troy II was so absolute that he was effectively erasing the evidence of the later lays. He saw the Greek and Roman settlements Troy 8 and 9, or Ilion Novum, as little more than annoying squatters on his Bronze Age prize. He failed to appreciate that these later cities were vital historical links, places of pilgrimage where Alexander the Great and later Roman emperors, most famously Augustus, had come to pay homage to the heroes of the Trojan War. The fact that these powerful historical figures believed Troy was at Hisarlik lent credence to the site, but Schliemann was too busy digging them up to appreciate their significance. The danger of his method was not just the physical destruction of the site, but the intellectual confusion he created. By mixing up artifacts from different layers, misidentifying their context, and throwing away the crucial ceramic evidence, he made it incredibly difficult for subsequent archaeologists to cleanly untangle the chronology. He often found beautiful artifacts and immediately assigned them to the Homeric age, even when the context screamed otherwise. This leads directly to our scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's dismissal of Calvert's expert guidance stemmed from genuine ignorance of scientific method, or a willful act of hubris designed to ensure his name, and his alone, would be forever associated with the discovery of Troy. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. He was ignorant of proper method, but too arrogant to admit he needed help, especially from a quiet, modest amateur like Calvert. The relationship between Schliemann and Calvert remained polite but frosty. Calvert allowed the excavation to proceed on his land, perhaps hoping that Schliemann's wealth would eventually reveal something great, even if it was done clumsily. Calvert's later attempts to correct Schliemann's chronological blunders were often met with dismissal, or even subtle character assassination in Schliemann's popular publications. Schliemann was a master of public relations and self-promotion, and Calvert, the quiet scholar, was simply no match for him in the arena of global celebrity. As the digging continued into the deepest levels of Troy II, the expectations were immense. Schliemann had publicized his dig worldwide, promising that he would find the palace and the treasure. The world was watching. The Ottoman authorities were watching, and Schliemann, driven by that 9-year-old boy's promise, was increasingly desperate to produce the kind of glittering, undeniable proof that would silence his academic critics forever. He had staked his reputation and his remaining life on finding Homeric gold. The stage was set for the most dramatic and most questionable discovery of his career, a discovery that would involve his young, brilliant, and equally passionate second wife, Sophia. The next great drama would not be about walls or pottery, but about gold, deception, and a flight in the night. The careful architect's caution was about to be obliterated by the treasure hunter's zeal. You are now in the deepest pit of the Schliemann Trench, breathing the stale air of Troy II, the city Schliemann erroneously believed to be the Troy of the Iliad. It is the year 1872, and the excavation has become less an academic pursuit and more a mining operation. Schliemann, the old merchant, is back in his element, moving earth, commanding labour, and driving toward a single spectacular profit: historical vindication. His method is brutally simple, volume over finesse. He employs an army of up to 160 labourers daily, directed by foremen who understood that their master's primary goal was to reach the Bronze Age citadel beneath the surface as quickly as possible. The workers, mostly local villagers, are equipped with pickaxes and shovels, not the delicate trowels and brushes associated with modern careful archaeology. You stand there, watching them heave out tons of earth and rubble. Everything that isn't a massive wall or a spectacular object is simply dumped onto massive spoil heaps outside the trench, effectively destroying the context of countless artifacts. The key casualty of this speed and single-mindedness is the principle of stratigraphy, the layering of history that the careful Frank Calvert had tried so desperately to explain. Schliemann's focus on Troy II the city dating to about 2500 BC, meant he had to dig through the remains of at least 4 major later cities. This is the mainstream historical fact to grasp. The most likely candidate for Homeric Troy, the sprawling, powerful Troy 6 circa 1700, 1250 BC, was largely demolished by his enormous central trench. He literally destroyed the evidence of the city he was hunting for. You can see the irony. Schliemann was so convinced that Homer's descriptions of massive walls demanded the oldest possible structure that he couldn't see the evidence of the true Homeric age city right in front of him. When his workers encountered the immense, sophisticated limestone walls of Troy 5, he simply dismissed them as Hellenistic or Roman, the work of later, inferior civilizations, and ordered them to be torn down or dug around. These walls, featuring impressive offset towers and a citadel much larger than Troy 2, would later be recognized as the true fortifications of Bronze Age Troy. His journals are riddled with details of magnificent walls being encountered and summarily destroyed in his rush to reach the deeper layers. He was, in effect, performing a grand, multi-layered vandalism project, funded by his millions. He knew what he wanted to find, and anything that contradicted that vision was simply an obstacle to be removed. This obsessive focus on a predetermined conclusion is what fuels the debate that historians still argue whether Schliemann's rapid destruction of critical stratigraphic layers was due to the technical limitations of 19th century archaeology, or a deliberate prioritization of personal glory over the preservation of historical data. There's little doubt that while stratigraphic methods were less refined then, Schliemann's choice to use hundreds of men and massive trenches instead of smaller controlled pits was a conscious, ego-driven decision to find a headline, not a dissertation. The artifacts he did find within the Troy 2 layer reinforced his misdating. He discovered numerous bronze tools, daggers, axes, and striking examples of gold jewellery, all of which he immediately declared to be the work of King Priam's people. The pottery from this era, however, known for its distinctive depas amphikypel on a tall, two-handled drinking cup mentioned in the Iliad, was found not just in Troy 2, but in several later layers, further confusing the timeline. Schliemann, with selective reading, seized on the cup's appearance in Homer to link his deep Troy 2 finds directly to the epic, ignoring all contradictory ceramic evidence. Here is a quirky tidbit about how he imposed his narrative onto the ruins. Schliemann was so determined to find the Homeric palace that he misinterpreted a series of large rectangular Bronze Age halls, Megara in the Troy 2 citadel. He quickly declared them to be the royal residence, the Palace of Priam, and named the citadel's main gate the Scaean Gate, the famous gate from which King Priam and Helen watched the battles in the plains below. The irony, of course, is that the real Scaean Gate and Priam's palace, if they existed, would have been in the Troy 6571, which he was busy destroying. He didn't find the ruins of Homer's Troy. He imposed Homer's names onto the ruins of a far older city. His disregard for the smaller, less glamorous finds also represents a massive loss. Pottery fragments, animal bones, seeds and charcoal. The mundane, everyday items that tell the true story of diet, trade and climate were largely discarded. These small details are the foundation of modern archaeological understanding. By throwing them away, he threw away the precise, minute details that would have correctly dated the site and built a complete picture of the city's life. He was a collector of spectacular showpieces, not a curator of social history. You can see the tension building on the site. Schliemann is becoming increasingly secretive, hiding the most valuable finds from his own workers and, crucially, from the Ottoman Imperial Commissioner, who was required by the Firman to inspect and catalogue all significant discoveries. The Commissioner, likely bored and perhaps bribed into complacence, was often conveniently absent or looking the other way. Schliemann used every trick he learned in the Russian black markets to conduct his great historical heist. He was driven by more than just intellectual proof. He was driven by the hunger for gold. His obsession with finding a spectacular treasure was the logical culmination of his life as a wealthy opportunist. A simple Bronze Age city was a mere entry in a scientific journal. A golden hoard attributed to the legendary King Priam was a guaranteed global front-page headline, cementing his immortality. He needed the gold to silence the critics who called him a reckless amateur, and to justify the immense wealth he had poured into this audacious scheme. The narrative was everything. He wasn't just digging for a city, he was stage-managing an archaeological spectacle. The destruction he wrought was all in service of a single, self-aggrandizing moment of discovery, a moment that was about to arrive with the dramatic discovery of what he immediately dubbed Priam's treasure. The stage was set, the evidence was buried, and the lie was about to be plated in gold. The year is 1873, the final season of this initial frenzied assault on Hisarlik. The massive trench has reached the layer Schliemann calls Troy II, the citadel he is certain belongs to King Priam. The relentless digging has exposed the rough-hewn stone ramparts, the charred timbers, and the massive scale of the conflagration that ended this city around 2500 BC. A scene is set for the climax of Schliemann's drama, a moment carefully constructed for maximum historical impact, fame, and profit. You are standing on the edge of the Schliemann Trench on May 31st, a day that would become one of the most famous and most disputed in archaeological history. Schliemann is supervising the demolition of a small stone wall or enclosure, which he later claims was located near the Scaean Gate, the supposed main entrance to Priam's city. He is, as ever, looking for something spectacular, something glittering. This is where his second wife, Sophia Schliemann, née Angastromeou, enters the dramatic narrative. A young, intelligent, and fiercely loyal Greek woman, Sophia had been carefully chosen by Schliemann for her classical education and her dedication to his dream. She was 25 years his junior, and while their relationship was often tumultuous, she was his invaluable partner in the field, speaking Greek to the labourers and sharing his relentless pursuit of glory. According to Schliemann's own later published account, he was working alone when he spotted something gleaming at the base of the small enclosure wall. He claims he immediately recognised the glint of gold. This is the core, sensational, mainstream historical fact of the discovery. Schliemann, in a moment of purported solo genius, unearthed an enormous hoard of gold artefacts, silver vessels and bronze weapons. His narrative of the discovery is theatrical in the extreme. You are told to picture Schliemann, recognising the supreme importance of the find and realising the imminent threat of the Ottoman Imperial Commissioner, who was meant to be present on site. He immediately shouts, "Fire! Fire!" The alarm sends the Commissioner and the labourers scattering, allowing Schliemann a brief, crucial window of time to secure the hoard without official oversight. He claims he then, with the help of Sophia, used a knife to cut out the massive bronze shield or container surrounding the treasure and carried the priceless contents away in Sophia's shawl, away from the prying eyes of the panicked workmen and the retreating commissioner. The official record suggests the treasure was spirited back to their hut and concealed, possibly in a box beneath their bed, for the next few days. The treasure of Priam, as Schliemann immediately dubbed it, was spectacular. It included 2 magnificent gold diadems, headdresses, thousands of minute gold beads, earrings, elaborate rings, buttons, and intricate chains, alongside silver jugs, bronze cauldrons, and even a unique copper shield. The total count was nearly 9,000 individual items, a display of wealth unprecedented in Aegean archaeology at that time. It was the physical, glittering proof that Schliemann had been looking for, a vindication of his $30 million investment in a childhood dream. Now for the quirky tidbit that immediately cast doubt on the entire narrative. Schliemann's story about Sophia being present, wrapping the gold in her shawl and rushing it away, is almost certainly a fabrication. Letters and records indicate that Sophia was not even at Hisarlik at the end of May 1873. She was in Athens tending to family matters. This strongly suggests that the dramatic tale of the discovery, the fire, ruse, the hurried flight with a shawl full of gold, was a piece of brilliant, self-aggrandizing theatre crafted after the fact to maximize the impact of the announcement, and, crucially, to justify the immediate illegal removal of the artifacts. Schliemann was a master of marketing. He knew a good story was worth more than a dry archaeological report. He needed a romantic, immediate connection to the treasure, and Sophia provided the perfect foil for his heroic narrative. The ultimate, iconic image used to publicize the discovery, a photograph taken later in Athens, showing Sophia Schliemann wearing the most elaborate of the gold diadems, the jewels of Helen, was a further layer of intentional misdirection. By naming the treasure after the legendary King Priam, and the jewels after Helen of Troy, Schliemann cemented an immediate, undeniable link in the public mind between his gold and the epic poem, regardless of scientific dating. However, the scientific problem remains. The hoard was found in Troy II, the city destroyed around 2500 BC. The Trojan War, the historical event associated with Priam and Helen, is dated to around 1250 BC. The treasure Schliemann found predated the Trojan War by a monumental 1250 years. He found Bronze Age treasure, yes, but it was not Priam's. It belonged to an anonymous king or queen of a much earlier, equally powerful but completely different civilization. This leads to the major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's attribution of the gold hoard to King Prime was an honest, if incorrect, conclusion based on limited 19th century dating techniques, or a deliberate, spectacular lie designed to manipulate the press and legitimize his unauthorized theft from the Ottoman Empire. Given his track record of exaggeration and his proven willingness to construct fictional narratives like Sophia's presence, the latter seems highly probable. He needed the name Priam to ensure his fame and the treasure's value. The act of naming was an act of ownership. By christening it Priam's treasure, he laid claim to the historical narrative, effectively sidelining any academic attempt to correct the dating. The fact that he concealed the discovery for days and then immediately transported it out of the Ottoman Empire confirms his illegal intent from the start. He was not prepared to follow the terms of the Firman and hand over the significant finds to the Imperial Museum. The treasure, once safely hidden, would soon embark on a journey as dramatic as the one he claimed to have had finding it. The immediate aftermath would be a global sensation and a political crisis. Schliemann, the formerly ridiculed amateur, had produced gold, and in doing so he had become an international figure, a hero to the public, a fraud to many scholars, and a thief to the Ottoman government. The hunt for the lost city had just turned into a high-stakes international legal battle over missing millions in gold. The dramatic discovery of Priam's treasure, on May 31st, 1873, was only the first act in Heinrich Schliemann's grand global drama. The second act, which began immediately, was the act of theft and evasion, a masterful piece of international smuggling that cemented his fame while simultaneously branding him a criminal. You are now a silent observer to a brazen historical heist, executed by a man who treated an entire empire's legal system with contempt. Within hours of the discovery, having fabricated the story of the fire and the dramatic rescue by Sophia, he remembered was actually in Athens, Schliemann had the thousands of golden artifacts concealed. His account claims he hid the gold under his hut, possibly beneath his own bed. The sheer panic and excitement must have been immense. He had the undeniable, glittering proof of his dreams, but now he faced the immediate, terrifying reality. The Ottoman firman explicitly stated that all major finds belonged to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. Schliemann, the seasoned merchant who had made his fortune skirting regulations during wartime, saw the Ottoman Empire not as the rightful owner, but as a tedious customs official trying to confiscate his hard-won spoils. He had no intention of surrendering the gold. For him, the treasure was not just a collection of artifacts. It was the physical validation of his life's work and the core of his personal legend. To hand it over would be to give the Ottomans the glory, and the scholars the right to dissect and potentially disprove his dating. The immediate problem was extraction. Schliemann needed to move 9,000 items, diadems, vessels, weapons, and countless beads out of the trade across the Aegean and into the relative safety of a European state. This is the mainstream historical fact. Schliemann violated the terms of his permit by secretly removing the entirety of the gold hoard from Turkish soil and transporting it to Greece. The details of the actual smuggling operation are, unsurprisingly, murky, but they speak to Schliemann's meticulous planning and ruthlessness. You can imagine the tension as the wooden crates, packed with the gold, were spirited away from Hisarlik under the cover of darkness. It likely involved a combination of bribery, deception, and the use of loyal local intermediaries. He used his extensive network and his American passport as a shield. The crates were first transported to the port of Çanakkale, and then likely shipped to Athens, the city that was now his base and Sophia's home. Once the treasure was safely across the Aegean and in Athens, Schliemann launched the second, equally crucial part of his plan: public relations. He didn't just announce the find, he orchestrated a global media spectacle. He immediately began writing detailed, self-congratulatory accounts of the discovery, sending them to major newspapers and scientific journals across Europe and America. The world reacted with stunned awe. The public, who had grown up with the stories of Achilles and Odysseus, were captivated by the idea that a single man had validated the most famous epic poem in history. Schliemann became an overnight sensation, a historical hero who had conquered the armchair skeptics of academia. Went global, instantly linking the spectacular gold to the legendary King of Troy. A masterful piece of marketing that, you already know, was chronologically false. The iconic image that followed, the photograph of his beautiful young wife Sophia Schliemann, wearing the large gold diadem and matching necklaces, the jewels of Helen, was the perfect visual propaganda. It was pure theatre, turning dry archaeology into a romantic, living, breathing fairy tale. The gold was sensational, but the story of the gold was priceless. This image was disseminated across the world, making the gold an immediate, non-negotiable part of Schliemann's personal narrative. Here is a quickie tidbit that reveals the cynical nature of his PR campaign. Schliemann was so focused on the grandeur of the gold that he virtually ignored another major find from the same deposit, a spectacular silver vessel containing several ingots of gold. He didn't immediately feature it because the thousands of individual pieces of jewellery were more visually stunning and lent themselves better to the narrative of a king's personal treasury. He prioritised immediate impact and romantic narrative over the sober reality of the find's composition. The instant fame, however, came at a steep price: international legal confrontation. The Ottoman authorities were predictably enraged. They were publicly humiliated, having been outsmarted by a foreigner who had not only breached his contract, but had effectively stolen what they considered to be part of their national heritage. This is the moment that launches the missing millions part of our story in earnest. The Turkish government immediately revoked Schliemann's firman, banned him from any future excavation in the Ottoman Empire, and, most importantly, initiated a lawsuit against him for the theft of the treasure. They demanded the return of the entire hoard, or compensation for its monetary value. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's deliberate act of smuggling the treasure was ultimately justified because it saved the gold from a war-torn or politically unstable region, or if this justification is merely a retroactive excuse for a clear act of cultural appropriation and theft. Schliemann himself would later use the saving the treasure argument to defend his actions, claiming that the Ottoman Imperial Museum was too primitive and disorganized to properly house and protect such a vital find. The immediate reaction from the Ottoman Empire was a diplomatic fury that threatened to engulf the archaeological community. Schliemann, protected by his American citizenship and the safe distance of Athens, ignored the threats. He began negotiations with various European capitals, quietly sounding out interest in purchasing the hoard. He turned a historical discovery into a highly liquid stolen asset worth millions. His priority was to find a buyer who would not only pay a high price, but also provide a secure, politically safe home for the treasure, solidifying his own legacy as its discoverer, not just its thief. The stage was set for the decade-long legal and ethical battle that would determine the fate of the gold and the reputation of the man who found it. The euphoria of the Priam's treasure discovery was short-lived for Heinrich Schliemann. You now witness the inevitable backlash, the transition from archaeological triumph to international legal entanglement. The gold secreted away to Athens may have been out of the physical grasp of the Ottoman Empire, but its theft initiated a diplomatic fury that directly challenged Schliemann's reputation and his ill-gotten fortune. The moment the news of the spectacular gold hoard reached Constantinople, the reaction was swift and furious. The Ottoman imperial government was publicly humiliated. A wealthy foreigner had not only abused the privilege granted by the firman, but had actively outsmarted the imperial commissioner and stolen artifacts of immense cultural and monetary value. This act of brazen larceny struck at the heart of the Sultan's sovereignty and exposed the weaknesses of the Ottoman regulatory system. The immediate consequence was an official and total revocation of Schliemann's right to dig. This is the mainstream historical fact. The Ottoman government immediately banned Schliemann from ever excavating again within their borders and commenced legal proceedings against him. They were not merely seeking a fine, they were demanding the return of the entire hoard or the payment of massive compensation for its value. The value, even in 1873, was assessed at a figure that represented true wealth, a sum that adjusted for inflation ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The missing millions have become a tangible legal claim. Schliemann, safe in Athens, remained outwardly defiant, using his American citizenship and his burgeoning international fame as a shield. He dismissed the Ottoman claims as the greedy demands of Oriental despots, and leveraged public opinion in Europe, which largely viewed the Ottoman Empire as backward and undeserving of such sophisticated artifacts. He cleverly presented himself as the saviour of the treasure, arguing that had he left it in the trode, it would have been sold off piece by piece or melted down. The lawsuit filed by the Ottoman Empire was a complex affair. It was heard in the Greek courts, as Schliemann had brought the artifacts to Athens. The case centred on the clear violation of the firman, the contract Schliemann had signed. He tried every legal manoeuvre possible, delaying tactics, attempts to bribe Ottoman officials, and continuous public relations campaigns designed to paint the Ottomans as the villains. The core of Schliemann's defense was a blend of legal technicality and moral posturing. He argued that the gold was found in the oldest layer of Troy too, and was therefore outside the scope of the firman, which he claimed was primarily concerned with classical post-Homeric Greek all-Roman remains. This was a weak argument, easily refuted by the terms of the permit, which clearly covered all major finds. His stronger argument, the one that resonated with European public opinion, was the preservation argument, that he had acted to save the treasure for humanity. This leads to the quirky tidbit about Schliemann's financial manoeuvres during the lawsuit. To settle the claim and buy himself freedom from perpetual legal entanglement, Schliemann eventually offered a payment of 50,000 francs to the Ottoman government. This was a significant amount, but was widely considered a paltry sum compared to the actual value of the treasure. However, the Ottomans, desperate for a diplomatic win and some financial compensation, initially accepted this settlement in principle. Schliemann, being Schliemann, then refused to pay the full amount, claiming that the Ottomans were still harassing his agents. He eventually paid a slightly higher sum of 80,000 francs, a figure he claimed was a gesture of goodwill, not an admission of guilt. This payment, a relative pittance compared to the treasure's value, effectively bought him legal immunity from the Ottoman Empire, allowing him to keep the gold. The settlement, while closing the legal chapter with the Ottomans, infuriated the academic world. Many saw it as a clear allegation that Schliemann was a thief who had simply paid a small ransom for a treasure worth vastly more. His ability to turn a clear legal violation into a financially advantageous settlement solidified his reputation as a man who could outmaneuver any system. The gold hoard, now secured in Athens, became the centre of a different kind of debate, the academic one. Schliemann, having escaped the clutches of the Sultan, now faced the scrutiny of European scholars. You desperately wanted a major institution to acquire the gold, which would not only provide a massive influx of cash, but would also permanently legitimize his discovery and his dating. He began shopping the treasure around Europe, offering it first to the newly unified Italian government, then to the Louvre in Paris, and the British Museum in London. His terms were not just financial, they were about legacy. He demanded that the collection be displayed in its entirety, labelled as Priam's treasure, and prominently credited to him. He was selling history, but on his own highly restrictive terms. The institutions, while all struck by the gold, were wary of the controversy and the dubious origin of the artefacts. The ethical shadow of the Ottoman lawsuit hung heavily over the negotiations. Eventually he found a willing buyer in his native Germany. The historians still argue whether the German Kaiser and the Berlin Museum's eventual acquisition of the treasure was a necessary act of cultural preservation, or an unethical transaction that rewarded Schliemann's theft and undermined international archaeological ethics for decades to come. Berlin's acquisition of the gold in 1881, for a sum of approximately 5 million gold marks, a vast amount, that pleased Schliemann greatly, provided the gold with a secure home and gave Schliemann the ultimate vindication. A major European power now, by its purchase, legitimized his claim to the discovery. With the gold now safely housed in the Museum of Pre- and Early History in Berlin, Schliemann was finally free of the Sultan's immediate fury and the threat of legal action. The payment bought him the right to be remembered as the man who found Troy, not the man who stole its relics. However, the academic debate over the gold's true dating and the ethical stain of its acquisition would follow the treasure and Schliemann for the rest of his life and well beyond. The focus now shifted from the legal battle over the millions to the scholarly fight over the historical truth. With the gold hoard now safely, if controversially, in Heinrich Schliemann's possession, the focus shifts entirely to the question of its historical authenticity. Was this truly the treasure of King Priam, the glittering legacy of the city besieged by Agamemnon and Achilles? Or was the name merely a spectacular fabricated narrative designed to elevate a magnificent archaeological find into a world historical event? You are now standing in the centre of the scholarly storm, where bronze and gold meet scepticism. The immediate moment of truth for the treasure came down to dating. Schliemann, driven by his lifelong obsession, declared unequivocally that the treasure, found alongside the monumental walls of Troy II, must belong to the Trojan War era conventionally dated around 1250 BC. The public, swayed by the sheer drama and the iconic photograph of Sophia Schliemann wearing the diadem, believed him instantly. However, the academic community, already sceptical of Schliemann's brute force methods, was quick to point out the chronological impossibility. This is the mainstream historical fact that undermined Schliemann's claim. The layer he designated as Troy II, where the gold was found, was determined by later more refined analysis to date back to roughly 2500 BC, a stunning 1,250 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. The city of the Iliad was likely Troy 6 or 7 E, layers built more than a millennium after the treasure of Priam was buried. The implications were profound. Schliemann had found a real spectacular Bronze Age hoard, but it was the treasure of an anonymous king or queen who reigned long before the age of Mycenaean heroes. He didn't find Priam's gold. He found the gold of the ancient early Bronze Age inhabitants of Hisarlik, who had suffered their own catastrophic destruction far predating Homer. The objects themselves presented further complications. The style of the gold jewellery, particularly the diadems with their elaborate chains and pendants, and the specific metal types found, do not align with what is known about the Mycenaean world the time of the Trojan War. Instead, the artifacts show strong affinities with other early Bronze Age cultures in Anatolia and the Aegean, cementing the earlier dating. The large number of bronze shields, silver vessels and copper implements painted a picture of a powerful but far older civilization than the one Schliemann sought. The controversy was not just about the date, but about the circumstances of the find. Schliemann claimed a hoard was neatly packaged in a copper shield in a silver vase, buried adjacent to the Scaean Gate. This highly structured and intact discovery was viewed with immense suspicion by scholars, who understood that the deep, destructive trench Schliemann had dug made it impossible to prove the find's true context. Here is a quirky tidbit that casts a long shadow over the veracity of the discovery. Some scholars suggested that Schliemann, anxious for a spectacular find that he could connect directly to Homer, might have found the artifacts over a period of time, perhaps even acquiring some from local dealers, and then staged the entire discovery on that fateful May Day in 1873. The fact that his narrative about Sophia assisting him was proven false, and his need for a spectacular headline was so great, gave credence to the idea of a staged event. He might have collected the gold over weeks, and then announced it as a single dramatic discovery to ensure maximum impact on easy smuggling. Furthermore, the famous photograph of Sophia wearing the jewels became a point of academic derision. The gold items, diadems, earrings, necklaces, were clearly not meant to be worn all at once. They were separate pieces, perhaps from multiple individuals, clumsily draped over Sophia for the camera. The sheer quantity of the jewels on her head, including the distinctive Carnes earrings, made the photograph less a historical portrait and more a lavish costume photo, further undermining the sincerity of the find's presentation. The ultimate question was whether Schliemann was a visionary who proved the existence of Troy, or a liar who contaminated the site's history for personal glory. This brings us to the core scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the misdating of Priam's treasure was an excusable error resulting from Schliemann's genuine, passionate belief in Homer's literal truth, or a calculated, deliberate fraud intended to manufacture public validation for his controversial and illegal acquisition of the artifacts. The consensus leans towards the view that while the find itself was real and important, the name Priam's treasure and the associated narrative were a deliberate invention, a successful historical brand. Despite the scholarly skepticism, Schliemann continued to excavate, determined to find further proof, even if it meant adjusting his theories. He had secured the money and the fame from Troy II, but the academic critics still stung him. He would eventually return to Hisarlik, and it is here, in the later phases of excavation, that a more systematic approach would begin to correct his initial, colossal errors. The legacy of the treasure, even stripped of its mythical name, remains immense. It was the first major discovery of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, effectively igniting the systematic search for Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations, and providing an invaluable corpus of early Bronze Age metalwork. It proved that Hisarlik was an immensely wealthy and significant site, with a long history stretching back thousands of years before the Trojan War. Schliemann, having escaped the Sultan's fury and secured his gold in Berlin, used the ensuing controversy to propel himself back into the field. He recognized that to truly silence his critics, he needed more than just gold, he needed a method. His next key move was to ally himself with a meticulous, systematic scholar who could provide the rigor that his own genius lacked. This shift would eventually lead to the rediscovery of the true candidate for Homer's Troy, the city he had inadvertently tried to destroy in his haste for Priam's gold. The missing millions had been found and relocated, but the missing context remained. The year is now 1882, nearly a decade after the scandalous theft of Priam's treasure, and Heinrich Schliemann returns to Hisarlik, a changed, though certainly not humbled man. His return was contingent upon securing a new firman from the Ottoman government, a process made agonizingly difficult by his past criminal behaviour. He finally succeeded, largely by agreeing to work under the strict supervision of an Ottoman commissioner, and by promising with his fingers crossed, no doubt to adhere to a revised, stricter set of regulations. But the most significant factor in this new phase of excavation was not the Ottoman regulations. It was the arrival of a quiet, meticulous German architect named Wilhelm Dörtfeld. Gottfeld was everything Schliemann was not. Trained, methodical, patient, and primarily interested in architecture and precise stratigraphy, not sensational headlines. You see Dörtfeld arrive, surveying the colossal scar of the Schliemann Trench and probably sighing deeply. Schliemann needed Dörtfeld's technical expertise to provide the scientific rigour that would finally silence his critics. Dörtfeld needed Schliemann's seemingly inexhaustible funding to conduct a proper, systematic excavation. It was a Faustine bargain for both men, but one that would ultimately revolutionise the understanding of Troy. Dörtfeld immediately set about introducing modern, systematic archaeological methods. He was instrumental in correcting Schliemann's colossal errors in dating and site interpretation. This is the mainstream historical fact of Dörtfeld's contribution. He recognised and correctly identified the complex layering of the site, and crucially, proved that Schliemann's beloved Troy II was indeed centuries too old to be Homer's city. He began the painstaking process of disentangling the mess Schliemann had made. Dörtfeld's architectural training allowed him to accurately map and differentiate the various walls and structures from the different layers. He recognised that the various structures Schliemann had haphazardly grouped were actually separated by distinct destruction layers and long periods of abandonment and rebuilding. He meticulously divided the 9 major settlements into sublayers 2A, 2B, 2C, etc., providing a far more detailed and accurate chronology. His most important realization, the one that corrected Schliemann's greatest blunder, concerned the monumental stone walls that Schliemann had blasted through and dismissed as Roman or Hellenistic, the magnificent fortifications of Troy VI. Dörtfeld studied the pottery and architectural styles associated with these walls, and realized they were unequivocally late Bronze Age, exactly the period scholars associated with the Mycenaean civilization and the time frame of the Trojan War circa 1250 BC. You can imagine the tension as Dörtfeld gently presented this evidence to the still stubborn Schliemann. The great discovery of Schliemann's life, the foundation of his fame, was wrong. The city of Priam was not the small, archaic citadel of Troy II. It was the sprawling, powerful fortress of Troy VI, a city Schliemann had largely destroyed in his rush to dig deeper. Surprisingly, Schliemann was eventually swayed by the irrefutable evidence. He had a powerful ego, but he also had a core commitment to proving Homer right, and if the proof lay in a layer he hadn't initially intended, he was prepared to shift his narrative. By the late 1880s, Schliemann publicly began to accept Dörtfeld's redating and the identification of the enormous citadel of Troy VI as the most likely candidate for Homer's city. Here is a quirky tidbit about the precision Dörtfeld introduced. He was one of the first archaeologists to insist on using the foundations of houses and the specific construction techniques of walls as primary dating evidence, rather than relying solely on easily moved artifacts like pottery or jewellery. He realized that a wall foundation, tied irrevocably to its layer, was a much more reliable anchor for chronology. He also pioneered more systematic drawing and photographic records of everything encountered, not just the spectacular items. Recognizing the informational value of the mundane, this was the birth of truly scientific excavation at Hisarlik. The identification of Troy VI painted a picture of a far grander city than Schliemann had imagined. The citadel of Troy VI was massive, featuring impressive defensive walls up to 16 feet thick and nearly 30 feet high, built in limestone with massive towers. Furthermore, subsequent excavations would reveal evidence of a large lower city extending far beyond the citadel, making Troy VI a truly powerful and strategic metropolis, the perfect description for the wide-way Troy of the Iliad. The final compelling piece of evidence Dörtfeld gathered concerned the destruction of Troy VI. He observed that the immense walls showed no signs of the extensive burning found in Troy II, but rather clear evidence of a powerful earthquake. Troy VI was violently destroyed, but not, it seemed, by fire and human hands. This led Dörtfeld to conclude that while Troy VI was the correct city, the destruction narrative in the Iliad might be conflating multiple events. or that the wall was followed by a natural disaster. This naturally leads us to the key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's eventual acceptance of Dörtfeld's superior chronology was a genuine display of intellectual honesty, or a calculated maneuver to maintain credibility and fund the continued excavations necessary to validate the myth of Troy with new, more accurate evidence. The consensus is that his acceptance was likely a combination of both. He knew he had to listen to the expert to keep his legacy intact, even if it meant admitting his gold was from the wrong king. Schliemann and Dörtfeld continued their collaborative yet always tense work until Schliemann's sudden death in 1890. Schliemann died a celebrated, wealthy, and still controversial figure, having founded Troy, even if he had to borrow Dörtfeld's meticulous science to find the right one. Dörtfeld carried on the work, continuing to refine the chronology, and ultimately proving that Hissarlik was indeed the site of the legendary city. The legacy of the Schliemann-Dörtfeld partnership is the crucial understanding of Troy's stratigraphy. They established that the city of the Iliad lay in the late Bronze Age layers, and that the story of Troy was not a simple tale of one wall, but a complex, 3,000-year-long history of successive civilizations built one upon the other, each deserving of respect and study, a lesson Schliemann only learned after he had already inflicted massive, irreparable damage in his treasure hunt. The millions Schliemann had spent were now backed by Dörtfeld's science, providing a powerful, if ethically tainted, foundation for all future research at the site. The meticulous work of Wilhelm Dörtfeld, following Heinrich Schliemann's death in 1890, finally brings you face to face with the true, sprawling city that is the most likely candidate for the Troy of the Iliad, Troy 6 and its successor, Troy 7a. You are no longer in the deep, narrow trench of Schliemann's Bronze Age obsession, Troy 2. You are surveying the vast, imposing ramparts higher up the mound, ramparts that Schliemann tragically dismissed in year later structures. The Dörtfeld, armed with superior architectural understanding and scientific method, revealed Troy the Sixth to be an immense late Bronze Age citadel that existed from approximately 1700 BC to 1250 BC. This is the mainstream historical fact you must grasp. The vast majority of scholarly opinion points to Troy the Sixth or its immediate successor, Troy the 7a, as the city that aligns chronologically and geographically with the events narrated by Homer. The discovery of specific types of Mycenaean pottery traded from mainland Greece during the time of the Iliad's heroes, within the layers of Troy Fix provided the crucial, irrefutable link that Schliemann's earlier finds lacked. This pottery allowed Dörtfeld and later archaeologists to accurately cross-date the city with the contemporary Mediterranean world, placing it squarely in the age of legendary conflict. You look upon the walls of Troy Fix and they are breathtaking. Unlike the smaller, rougher walls of Troy 2, these are towering structures of dressed limestone blocks, built with a sophisticated understanding of military engineering. The walls are up to 16 feet thick and featured massive projecting square towers designed to withstand siege. The sheer scale and complexity of these fortifications finally matched the Homeric epithet of mighty walled Troy. This was not just a fortified village. It was a powerful city, strategically placed to control the narrow passage between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, a critical choke point for trade and travel. The sheer size of the Troy 6 citadel, however, was still a source of confusion. Homer describes a large, wide-wayed city, and even these impressive walls seemed confined to a relatively small area on the summit of Hissarlik. It was not until the later 20th century that the work of the Tübingen and Cincinnati excavations, led by Professor Manfred Kaufmann, definitively solved this puzzle, proving that the high citadel was merely the upper town. Troy 6 was, in fact, surrounded by a massive lower city that extended across the plain, far beyond the initial visible walls. Kaufmann's team discovered a deep ditch and evidence of further defensive structures, which proved that the true metropolis of Troy the 657 covered an area 15 times larger than the citadel alone, making it one of the largest settlements of its time in the Aegean, a true Bronze Age capital. Schliemann, in his haste, had been searching for a village when he should have been looking for an empire. The city's power was rooted in its location. Troy sat at the intersection of trade routes linking Europe and Asia, the Aegean and the Black Sea. This powerful strategic position meant that the city would have grown wealthy from controlling traffic and trade, making it a highly desirable and inevitable target for rivals, a much more compelling reason for a long, expensive war than merely recapturing a single queen, Helen. Here is a quirky tidbit that Dörtfeld noted, which initially complicated the Homeric narrative. The destruction of Troy VI, which occurred around 1250 BC, did not seem to be caused by fire or siege, as Homer describes. Goethe found no widespread layer of ash and burned debris, but rather large cracks in the massive stone walls, and evidence of sudden collapse. He concluded that Troy VI was destroyed by a powerful earthquake, a conclusion later supported by geological evidence. This suggested that while the city did fall catastrophically at the correct historical time, the agent of destruction may have been nature, not the Achaean army. This discovery was partially accommodated by the layer that immediately followed, Troy 7a. This layer was a desperate, hasty rebuilding of the Troy 6 citadel, utilising the remnants of the old walls. It was densely packed with small houses, many with storage jars pithoi sunk into the floors for storing emergency supplies, a sign of fear and imminent threat. Crucially, Troy 7 was destroyed by a massive fire, an evidence of a violent assault around 1180 BC, a date that fits even better with the broader historical pattern of a Bronze Age collapse. This realization led many scholars to conclude that either Troy VI was the city that was besieged pre-earthquake, and the war caused its damage, or that Troy 7a was the last desperate city to be sacked by the returning Greeks. This brings us to the inevitable scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the single 10-year Trojan War was fought over the magnificent citadel of Troy 6, which suffered an earthquake, or the later, smaller and burned Troy 7a, or if the Iliad is a cultural memory conflating the multiple cycles of violence and destruction that occurred over the 150-year period between 1350 and 1200 BC. The fact that Schliemann, in his rush for gold, destroyed much of the evidence that would have definitively settled this question is a continuing source of archaeological frustration. The combined work of Schliemann and Dortfeld, for all its controversy, established a foundational understanding of the site. Hisarlik was a powerful, strategically vital settlement that underwent a catastrophic destruction at the very end of the Bronze Age, fitting the historical window for the Iliad. Dortfeld's meticulous technique redeemed the site from Schliemann's initial vandalism, giving us the picture of a true Bronze Age metropolis. The missing millions, however, remained exactly that, stolen, legally settled for a fraction of their worth, and now residing in a museum far away, awaiting their next dramatic historical relocation. You now follow the glittering stolen artifacts, the thousands of pieces known as Priam's treasure, on a geopolitical journey as dramatic as their discovery. After Heinrich Schliemann successfully smuggled the gold out of the Ottoman Empire and bought his legal freedom for a pittance, the hoard rested for several years in Athens. Schliemann, obsessed with securing his legacy, eventually found a permanent, prestigious home for his treasure in his native land. In 1881, Schliemann sold the collection to the Royal Museums of Berlin for a generous sum of roughly 1.5 million gold marks, a massive figure at the time. Fulfilling his contractual obligation to the museum by allowing them to display the collection in its entirety, labelled according to his specifications. The treasure, now owned by the German Empire, took up residence in the Museum of Pre- and Early History in Berlin, where it became a jewel in the crown of German archaeology. For the next 6 decades, the jewels of Helen, the silver vessels, and the bronze weapons were one of Berlin's major cultural attractions. They were studied, catalogued and displayed, all the while carrying the heavy baggage of their disputed origin and their chronologically incorrect name. The gold, however, remained safe, a symbol of German national pride and Schliemann's unique blend of scholarship and larceny. This peace was shattered by the outbreak of World War II. As the conflict intensified and Allied bombing campaigns began to turn German cities into rubble, the fate of the priceless cultural heritage became a matter of grave national security. This is the crucial mainstream historical fact. Like many significant museum collections in Europe, Priam's treasure had to be packed away and secreted for safekeeping during the war. You can imagine the tension in the Berlin Museum in 1939 and 1940. Curators and staff, knowing the immense historical and monetary value of the hoard, the missing millions now physically represented in gold, carefully catalogued, wrapped and packed the collection. The artifacts were distributed into sturdy wooden transport boxes and taken to various locations for underground storage. The primary hiding place chosen for the most valuable pieces of the hoard, including the intricate diadems and gold vessels, was the Berlin Zoo Flak Tower, or Hochbunker. This massive concrete structure, originally built as an anti-aircraft defence, featured thick reinforced concrete walls and large underground storage chambers that were considered impervious to Allied air raids. It was a secure, well-known government facility, seemingly the perfect hiding spot. The sheer value of the treasure meant that its exact location and contents were highly classified. Only a small handful of high-ranking museum officials and government personnel knew precisely where the various boxes were stored. As the war dragged on, and the situation in Berlin became increasingly desperate, the systematic record-keeping began to break down. The bureaucracy of the museum staff, once meticulous, was overwhelmed by the chaos of a collapsing state. Here is a quirky tidbit about the specific hiding place. The Flak Tower was also a designated civilian shelter. The priceless gold of an anonymous Bronze Age king was stored in the deep concrete vaults, while, only a few floors above, thousands of terrified Berliners huddled during the nightly bombing raids. The treasure of Troy, a symbol of ancient war, was literally sheltered inside a structure built for modern war. As the Red Army encircled Berlin in the final brutal weeks of the war, in April 1945, the situation at the Flak Tower became untenable. The museum staff was instructed to protect the objects, but the priority shifted from detailed management to mere survival. The final, critical move of the most valuable boxes of the treasure, those containing the key gold pieces, remains an area of intense historical dispute. Some museum records, confusingly, suggest the boxes were moved out of the tower just before the final Russian assault. Other accounts claim they remained in the reinforced vaults. In the fog of the Battle of Berlin, when the city was a shell of its former self, and documents were burned or lost, the paper trail of Priam's treasure simply vanished. When the Soviet forces finally captured Berlin and secured the city, they prioritized the confiscation of cultural assets, viewing them as both reparations for the destruction wrought on the Soviet Union and as legitimate trophy art. The recovery of lost or hidden German cultural property was a systematic operation handled by specialized Soviet trophy brigades. When these Soviet teams investigated the Zoo Flak Tower and other designated museum storage sites, many boxes were found. However, the boxes containing the core, identifiable gold artifacts of Priam's treasure were conspicuously absent. The world believed the hoard had either been destroyed in the bombing, melted down by desperate Nazis, or was simply lost forever in the rubble of the fallen city. This disappearance initiates the decades-long mystery of the missing millions. For the next 50 years, the fate of Priam's treasure became a legendary cold case. The German government assumed the treasure was destroyed and publicly mourned its loss. The world was left with the incredible fact that a treasure that had survived 3,000 years, a global legal battle, and a controversial relocation had seemingly vanished in the last weeks of a modern war. This sets the stage for the dramatic revelation to come. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of the treasure was a planned concealment by desperate Nazi officials hoping to reclaim it after the war, or a direct, immediate seizure by a highly specialized Soviet trophy brigade whose mission was kept secret for decades. The truth was wrapped in layers of Cold War secrecy, waiting for the political landscape to shift before the gold could resurface and spark the next international ethical battle. The millions in gold were not destroyed, they were simply moved, patiently waiting in the shadows of a superpower. You are now in the grim, silent heart of the Cold War, where the missing millions in gold, the treasure of an anonymous Bronze Age king, rests in deep secrecy. For nearly 50 years after the fall of Berlin, the fate of Priam's treasure remained one of the great cultural mysteries of the 20th century. The German public mourned its destruction, and the international scholarly community assumed the hoard was lost forever, either melted down or buried deep beneath the rubble of the city. The truth, however, was locked away behind the impenetrable walls of the Soviet Union. Following the capture of Berlin, specialized Soviet units, known as trophy brigades, systematically collected and transported vast quantities of German cultural property back to Moscow as both war reparations and strategic assets. These brigades, operating under the highest secrecy, treated the seizure of artworks, archives, and archaeological finds as a military operation. This is the mainstream historical fact that solved the mystery. The Call of Priam's treasure was indeed seized by the Red Army in May 1945 and secretly transferred to Moscow. The highly classified nature of this transfer was critical. The gold was not sent to the public Pushkin Museum or the Hermitage. Instead, the most valuable pieces were taken directly to the KGB's archives and later transferred to a deep, secure vault beneath the AS. Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, designated as a special collection or Spetsfond. Here, it was kept entirely out of public view, away from the eyes of foreign governments, academics, and even most Soviet museum staff. You can almost feel the weight of this Cold War secret. The treasure, the glittering symbols of ancient power, was now a political pawn in the modern global struggle. By keeping its existence a secret, the Soviet Union maintained a valuable piece of leverage and avoided international pressure for its return. To the world, it was lost. To the Kremlin, it was a secured asset. The secrecy surrounding the Spetsfond was so effective that when Western diplomats or museum directors inquired about the fate of the missing Berlin collections, Soviet officials, sometimes truthfully, sometimes with deliberate obfuscation, would simply state that its whereabouts were unknown or that it was likely destroyed during the final battle for the city. The silence finally broke with the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the political structure of the USSR began to crumble in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the tightly controlled secrets of the Cold War began to leak out. This period of glasnost and political upheaval created the opportunity for the truth to emerge. The dramatic revelation came in 1993, when a small group of Russian journalists and scholars, risking severe political backlash, began to publish articles detailing the existence of the Spetsfond collections. This was the moment of sensation. A detailed account, supported by internal Soviet documents, confirmed that the thousands of gold, silver, and bronze artifacts of Priam's treasure had survived the war intact and were housed in the Pushkin Museum's secret vaults in Moscow. The news hit the international media like a cultural earthquake. The missing millions, the treasure stolen once by Schliemann from the Ottoman Empire, had been stolen again by the Soviet Union from Germany. The gold hoard that had defined Schliemann's legacy was now defining post-Cold War international relations. Here is a quirky tidbit that underscores the secrecy. For decades, Russian museum staff who worked near the vault knew only that it contained highly valuable classified items. They referred to it only by code names, or by simply acknowledging that the most important things were kept there. The specific identity of the gold, that it was the fabled treasure from Troy, was known only to a very select high-level political and cultural elite within the Soviet system. The confirmation of the treasure's existence immediately led to its first public viewing. In 1996, the Russian government, despite immense international pressure for restitution, decided to display the treasure openly at the Pushkin Museum. This exhibition, titled The Treasure of Troy, Heinrich Schliemann's Discoveries, was a massive international event. You can imagine the sheer stunned silence in the gallery as visitors looked upon the familiar, iconic jewels of Helen, finally revealed after 50 years of darkness. The display was a powerful statement. Russia now possessed the treasure, and its future would be decided by the Russian state. This dramatic revelation immediately triggered the next, highly complex phase of the ethical and legal battle. Germany, which had suffered the second theft, immediately demanded the unconditional return of the gold, arguing that its wartime seizure constituted a war crime and illegal appropriation of cultural property. The newly independent Russian Federation, however, viewed the treasure as legitimate trophy art, acquired as compensation for the immense destruction inflicted upon the Soviet people and infrastructure by the Nazi regime. This brings us directly to the key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Russia's retention of the treasure as trophy art is a morally justified form of restitution for the overwhelming destruction wrought by the Nazi invasion, or if it constitutes a continuation of wartime illegality that fundamentally undermines international law regarding cultural heritage. The argument hinges on the fact that while the Soviet Union suffered unimaginably, the treasure had already been stolen once by Schliemann, meaning Germany's claim was also ethically compromised. The Moscow revelation did more than just recover lost artifacts. It forced a global reckoning with the concept of cultural ownership, war reparations, and the legacies of both ancient and modern conflicts. The missing millions were no longer a cold case. They were the centerpiece of a geopolitical and ethical conflict spanning Turkey, Germany, and Russia. The story of Troy, once again, was less about ancient heroes and more about modern greed and international law. The ethical debate was only just beginning. The dramatic reappearance of Priam's treasure in the vaults of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow did more than just solve a Cold War mystery. It ignited a fierce global ethical debate about the ownership of cultural heritage. A debate that involves three sovereign nations, Turkey, Germany, and Russia. You are now standing in the diplomatic arena, where ancient gold has become a proxy for modern national grievances. The moment of revelation in 1993 immediately saw Germany launch a demand for the unconditional return of the gold. Their position was simple and rooted in international law regarding cultural property. The treasure was legally owned by the Berlin museums before its wartime seizure by the Soviet Union. Germany argued that the removal of the gold was an act of illegal appropriation conducted under military force, and that the treasure must be repatriated to its pre-war location in Berlin. They viewed Russia's possession as a continuation of wartime illegality. The response from the newly formed Russian Federation was equally firm and based on the concept of trophy art or compensation in kind. This is the mainstream historical fact anchoring Russia's position. They argued that the seizure of German cultural property was legitimate compensation for the staggering and deliberate destruction of Soviet cities, infrastructure, and cultural sites by the Nazi invasion. The argument went that the Nazis destroyed a replaceable Russian heritage. The treasures of Tsarskoye Selo, the libraries of Leningrad, the palaces of Peterhof, and therefore the retention of German cultural property was a moral and material counterbalance for the scale of the loss. Furthermore, they pointed out that Tsarist Russia had been responsible for many of the original excavations in the Black Sea region, and had also seen artifacts plundered. A law passed by the Russian parliament essentially nationalized the trophy art, solidifying its status as Russian federal property. Then you must account for the third claimant, Turkey. The Turkish government, as the direct successor state to the Ottoman Empire, pointed out the original sin in the treasure's provenance. They argued that Schliemann, in 1873, stole the treasure from Turkish soil, violating his firman, which stipulated that major finds belonged to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople. They rightly contended that if the gold was to be repatriated anywhere, based on legitimate origin, it should return to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, near the site of Troy, in Turkey. Turkey's claim rested on the principle of provenance, the place of origin, making their ethical claim arguably the strongest, despite the two subsequent national seizures. This complexity creates a perfect legal and ethical Gordian knot. Germany's claim rests on ownership at the time of the second theft. Russia's claim rests on moral and material compensation for war. Turkey's claim rests on legitimate original national sovereignty over its own archaeological finds. The missing millions are now a legal boomerang flying across 3 continents. Here is a quirky tidbit that complicates the modern diplomatic reality. Schliemann, despite his crimes against Ottoman law, paid a settlement of 80,000 francs that officially, if unjustly, cleared him of all claims from the Ottoman Empire. Some legal scholars argue that this settlement, however inadequate, means that Schliemann, and by extension Berlin, held legal possession at the time of the Soviet seizure, complicating Turkey's claim of current ownership. However, others argue that an illegal act of theft cannot be legitimized by a paltry ransom, and therefore the gold's true ownership never left Turkish soil. The debate goes deeper than just legal titles. It addresses the fundamental ethics of archaeology itself. Schliemann's original theft was a prime example of 19th century cultural appropriation, where wealthy European nations and individuals felt entitled to remove artifacts from less powerful countries, often under the guise of saving them. The subsequent movements, from Berlin's museum to Moscow's secret vault, are seen by critics as merely one form of historical injustice piled upon another. The core scholarly debate now centres on which ethical principle should prevail. Historians still argue whether the principle of cultural restitution, demanding the return of illegally seized artifacts to their pre-war or original locations, must always supersede claims of wartime compensation and national patrimony, or if the unprecedented scale of Nazi destruction justifies Russia's retention of trophy art as a unique historical exception. There is no easy answer, and the dispute has soured cultural relations between Germany and Russia for decades. For now, the gold remains in Moscow. The public display at the Pushkin Museum has shifted the perception of the treasure from lost German heritage to Russian cultural property. The Russian government, facing economic and political instability in the 1990s and 2000s, has been resistant to any form of unconditional return, often suggesting that a compromise might involve long-term loans or joint exhibitions, an offer consistently rejected by Germany. The irony of the treasure's journey is profound. The gold that was named after King Priam, a man who lost everything to the War of the Achaeans, has spent the entirety of its modern life since discovery as a hostage of war, a symbol of national grievance, and a piece of property fought over by successors to empires. Schliemann's missing millions are not financially missing. They are ethically and legally missing, stuck in a geopolitical limbo, forever stained by the circumstances of their discovery and their subsequent movements. The final resolution to this ethical triangle, Turkey, Germany, Russia, remains elusive, guaranteeing that the complex, controversial story of Troy continues to be written in the halls of modern diplomacy. You leave the heated diplomatic chambers of Moscow and Berlin, and return to the dusty, sun-baked hill of Hisarlik, now viewed not through the ambitious, gold-tinted spectacles of Heinrich Schliemann, but through the objective lens of modern archaeology. The story of Troy did not end with Schliemann's death or Wilhelm Dorkfeld's refinement. It entered a new, methodical and truly scientific phase that would completely redefine the size and significance of the city. The most important figure in this modern era is Professor Manfred Kaufmann, a German archaeologist from the University of Tübingen. From 1988 until his death in 2005, Kaufmann led the new international team, the Troyer Miners Project, which conducted the most extensive and systematic excavations at the site. Kaufmann's work was the ultimate scientific rebuttal to Schliemann's destructive zeal, employing methods that Schliemann could only have dreamed of, or, more accurately, methods he actively chose to ignore. Kaufmann's team employed highly sophisticated, non-invasive techniques. This is the mainstream historical fact of the modern era. Instead of using Schliemann's brute-force trenches, Kaufmann utilized magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar, GPR. These tools allowed archaeologists to see beneath the ground without digging, mapping structures, roads, and defensive ditches hidden beneath the soil. This was the true, bloodless way to use the 3,000-year-old treasure map, revealing structures that lay well outside the confined citadel walls Schliemann and even Dorkfeld had focused on. The most revolutionary discovery of the Kaufmann era concerned the true scale of Troy 567A, the city of the Late Bronze Age. While Dorkfeld had established the importance of a high citadel, Kaufmann proved that this citadel was merely the upper town of a vast, sprawling metropolis. Using the magnetometry data, Kaufmann's team discovered a massive, sophisticated lower city that extended across the plain to the south of the citadel. This lower city was protected by a deep, V-shaped defense ditch, cut into the bedrock, and wooden palisades, extending over 400 meters south from the main walls. This discovery immediately validated Homer's description of a large, wide-awed city and transformed the perception of Troy from a modest fortress into a major regional capital. The true city was over 15 times larger than the area excavated by Schliemann. This new scale elevates Troy 565A from a simple trading outpost to a powerful geopolitical entity, perfectly positioned to control the maritime traffic through the Dardanelles. This strategic location, and the wealth it generated, provides a far more compelling historical motive for a 10-year siege than the simple recovery of a single queen. The war, if it happened, was likely about trade, control, and wealth, the same things that fueled Schliemann's own fortune. Here is a quirky tidbit about the modern finds. Kaufmann's team discovered a small bronze seal with a local Anatolian hieroglyphic script deep within the lower city. This was the first concrete evidence of a written language used by the inhabitants of Troy. More importantly, the seal script is associated with the Lui language, a tongue spoken by people in the powerful Hittite Empire to the east. This tiny object strongly suggests that Troy was not just a simple Greek-influenced port, but had deep political and cultural ties to the great Anatolian powers, placing it squarely within the diplomatic and military orbit of the ancient Near East. This linguistic and cultural evidence shifts the narrative from a purely Hellenic context to a complex Anatolian one, complicating the simple Greek versus Trojan dichotomy of the Iliad. Troy was fundamentally an Anatolian city facing a foreign aggressor, the Mycenaean Greeks. The work also focused on correcting the absolute chronology by meticulously analysing microsamples of charcoal, seeds and pottery fragments, the tiny details Schliemann routinely discarded. Kaufmann's team refined the dating of the destruction of Troy's Avenir to around 1180 BC, a date that fits almost perfectly with the broader historical period known as the Bronze Age collapse, a turbulent time when numerous civilizations across the Mediterranean, Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, suffered catastrophic, near-simultaneous collapse, often attributed to both internal strife and the arrival of the mysterious sea peoples. This evidence suggests the Trojan War was not an isolated incident, but likely one theatre in a massive regional conflagration. The attackers, the Mycenaean Greeks, would themselves face collapse soon after, adding a final bitter layer of irony to the tale. The enduring challenge for modern archaeology at Troy remains the destructive legacy of its first excavator. Historians still argue whether the wealth of information gained through Kaufmann's non-invasive techniques compensates for the permanent, irretrievable loss of context and stratigraphic data caused by Schliemann's massive early excavations, particularly within the crucial Troy the 5758 layers. The consensus is that while modern science provides incredible insights, we will never fully recover the detailed archaeological record that was destroyed in the rush for Priam's gold. Schliemann's missing millions, therefore, represent not just gold, but the millions of pieces of discarded evidence that could have definitively answered the question of Troy's fate. Kaufmann's legacy is one of international cooperation and scientific excellence, a stark contrast to Schliemann's lone wolf methodology. The Troya project involved dozens of international specialists, ensuring a collaborative and rigorous approach. It proved that the true treasure of Troy was not the gold hoard, but the multi-layered, complex historical record contained within the hill itself. The challenge now is to weave together the scientific data with the literary tradition, a task that has occupied scholars for centuries. The story now moves from the soil to the scrolls, attempting to find the history hidden within Homer's epic poetry. You now step away from the physical ruins of Hisarlik and enter the realm of literary criticism and historical probability. The scientific proof that a wealthy, powerful city, Troy 657A, was violently destroyed at the correct chronological period, circa 1250-1180 BC, is immense. But does the existence and destruction of a city prove the history of the Trojan War as told in Homer's Iliad? This is the ultimate question. For millennia, the Iliad was treated as an unparalleled work of poetry, a masterpiece of literary fiction. Heinrich Schliemann's great contribution was to force the world to consider it as a potential work of historical memory. Modern scholarship, standing on the evidence unearthed by Dirtfeld and Kaufmann, now accepts that the war, or a series of conflicts, is rooted in historical reality. This is the mainstream historical fact we operate on. While the Iliad is fictionalized, exaggerated, and heavily embellished with divine intervention and heroic feats, it acts as a cultural repository of memories from the Mycenaean Bronze Age. The core debate among historians and classicists, however, is whether the Trojan War was a single, 10-year siege led by a unified Achaean army for the specific purpose of retrieving Helen, or if it was a cultural memory conflating centuries of regional conflicts and raids. The sheer logistics of a 10-year siege in the Bronze Age are highly improbable. Think about the challenges. Maintaining a unified alliance of hundreds of city-states like Mycenae, Sparta and Athens for a decade, provisioning an army of thousands of men and their horses from across the Aegean, and keeping political stability at home in Greece while all the kings were away. The practicalities strain credulity. It's far more likely that the epic conflates a series of smaller, repeated conflicts over generations, unified in the poem for narrative effect. The literary evidence itself supports the idea of conflation. The Iliad contains anachronisms, details that don't belong to the same historical period. Gomer describes the heroes using bronze weapons, which is correct for the late Bronze Age 1600-120 BC, the time of Troy 5675A. Yet, he also describes the burial rites and political structures that are characteristic of the later Iron Age c. 1100 BC, the time in which the poem was actually written down. The famous reference to the Trojan horse, for instance, is never mentioned in the Iliad itself. It is an addition found in later accounts like the Odyssey and the Aeneid. This blend of archaic and later details suggests the poem is a mosaic of different historical memories. Here is a quirky tidbit that connects Troy to the larger geopolitical landscape. Archives discovered in Hattusa, the capital of the powerful Hittite Empire to the east of Troy, contain diplomatic correspondence from the late Bronze Age. These cuneiform tablets reference a region in the west known as Wilusa, which scholars believe is the Hittite name for Ilios, or Troy, and the powerful kingdom of Ahiawa, believed to be the Mycenaean Achaeans. The documents record tensions and sometimes military interventions between the Hittites and the Ahiawa over control of Wilusa, confirming that the Troad was a major, contested geopolitical flashpoint long before Homer. The war, if it happened, was less about Helen and more about the geopolitical rivalry between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite-aligned Anatolian states. The archaeological evidence from Troy 658 supports the idea of a long, desperate conflict. The city shows signs of repeated, massive rebuilding and fortification efforts, particularly during Troy 6, suggesting a persistent external threat. Troy 7a, the final, burnt layer, is characterized by its tiny, densely packed houses and the numerous storage jars, pithoi, sunk into the floors for emergency provisions, all indicators of a city under duress, anticipating a long siege or attack. This is a city that expected trouble, which strongly suggests repeated generational military threats from the Aegean. This brings us to the key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the historical reality behind the Trojan War was a single, definitive Achaean campaign against a great rival, an event that became mythologized due to its singular importance, or a slow, grinding process of economic warfare and intermittent raiding that merely culminated in the final destruction of Troy the 7 year. The consensus is that the poetry's power lies in condensing this long, complex historical reality into a dramatic, singular narrative that could be summed and remembered. The war was real, but the timeline was likely stretched and compressed. The treasure, the missing millions that started Schlieman's hunt, also plays a symbolic role in this historical debate. While the gold itself predates the war by a millennium, its mere existence proves that Troy was, for centuries, a highly desirable and immensely wealthy place. The city had the resources and strategic importance to warrant a major protracted military effort. The hunt for the gold, driven by Schlieman's passion, simply mirrored the Achaean desire for the wealth and control that the city represented. Ultimately, the great paradox of the Trojan War is that the archaeological finds, the monumental walls, the Mycenaean pottery, the destruction layers, confirm the story as true in its broadest sense. A powerful Greek-speaking coalition waged a devastating war against a powerful Anatolian city at the end of the Bronze Age. But the details, the hero names, the 10 years, the involvement of Zeus, are the poetry. Schliemann proved that the city was real. Derfeld and Kaufmann showed us its true size, and the scholars now tell us that the 3,000-year-old treasure map was part history, part epic, and all legend. You have tracked the 3,000-year-old treasure map from a small boy's dream in Prussia to the colossal multi-layered reality of Hisarlik and the secret vaults of Moscow. We now arrive at the conclusion of our journey, reflecting on the complex, often contradictory legacy of Heinrich Schliemann, the ultimate fate of the missing millions, and why the city of Troy continues to captivate the world. Schliemann's legacy is perhaps the most vexing paradox in archaeology. He was undeniably a man of profound genius. He used his immense self-made fortune to prove that one of Western civilization's founding myths was rooted in historical fact. He forced academia out of its armchairs and onto the dust-filled plains of Anatolia. His discoveries at Troy and later at Mycenae sparked the systematic study of the entire Greek Bronze Age, a mainstream historical fact that no modern archaeologist can deny. He was a catalyst, a necessary disruption that forced archaeology to evolve from gentlemanly antiquarianism into a science. Yet his legacy is permanently stained by his methods. You recall the monstrous Schliemann trench that sliced through centuries of history, the misdating of Priam's treasure, and the brazen act of smuggling the gold out of the Ottoman Empire. His drive for personal glory and public validation led him to sacrifice scientific rigour and irretrievably destroy crucial evidence in the layers of Troy 5 IVA, the very city he sought. He proved Troy existed, but he did so by robbing it of its context. He was a great discoverer but a terrible archaeologist. The fate of the missing millions, the gold hoard itself, encapsulates this entire story. The treasure, found in the wrong layer and attributed to the wrong king, has a monetary value today that is incalculable, easily stretching into the tens of millions of dollars, not just for the intrinsic value of the gold, but for its unique historical significance as a major early Bronze Age find. However, its value is dwarfed by the legal and ethical price it commands. The missing millions are not financially missing, they are legally displaced. The Turkish government's claim to the gold based on original provenance remains ethically compelling. Germany's demand for its return, based on its status as seized trophy art from a museum, remains legally grounded in the context of international cultural property conventions. Russia's continued retention of the gold as legitimate compensation in kind for wartime destruction remains a stubborn political reality. The gold, therefore, is perpetually stuck in a state of political limbo, a glittering reminder that the spoils of war, whether ancient or modern, are never easily returned. Here is a quirky tidbit about the cyclical nature of Schliemann's career. The very first fortune Schliemann made was derived from the supply and profit of war during the Crimean War. His final greatest discovery, the gold hoard, is itself permanently locked in a dispute stemming from a subsequent, much larger war, World War II. The entire trajectory of the man's archaeological life, from funding to fate, is inexorably linked to the violence and greed of conflict. The continued excavations, particularly the work of Manfred Kaufmann and his successors, have redeemed the site from Schliemann's vandalism, providing a sophisticated, multi-layered understanding of the region. They have confirmed that the Troad was a powerful, strategically vital crossroads, and that the city of Troy the 6th, the 7A, was a major Bronze Age metropolis, a prize worthy of a 10-year war. The combination of Homeric poetry, Hittite administrative records, and definitive Mycenaean pottery shards provides overwhelming proof that the events were not mere fantasy, but a distillation of real, historical, and protracted conflict. The story's final enduring question is one we posed at the start. Why does Troy hold such immense power over the human imagination? The answer lies in the tragic brilliance of the original poet Homer. Troy is the foundation myth of Western culture, a narrative of courage and catastrophe, of human hubris and divine meddling. It is the perfect story of a city that was mighty and wealthy, but ultimately doomed by fate and the relentless ambition of its enemies. Schliemann, in his way, simply reenacted the theme, a man driven by ambition who brought ruin upon a great thing in his attempt to possess it. This leads to the final necessary scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the lasting legacy of the hunt for Troy is primarily the spectacular validation of the Homeric epics, or the unfortunate precedent set by Schliemann's methods, which institutionalized the idea that cultural heritage could be violently acquired and then legitimized through wealth and public relations. The shadow of the missing millions, the stolen gold, ensures that the ethical debate will continue to rage long after the scientific questions are settled. But tonight, as the dust settles over the colossal walls of Troy the Six, and the gold remains hidden in the secure vaults of Moscow, you are left with the silence of history. The walls are real, the destruction was real, and the passion of the man who found it was undeniably real. The treasure map, drawn by a blind poet and followed by an obsessed merchant, was never about gold. It was about proving the enduring truth of a bedtime story.